So I grew up here that's on the wrong screen. Hold on one second.
This is going to be a pretty casual discussion today. Molly and I go back many, many years, and we're sort of viewing this as a fireside chat about planning topics. So pretty casual. Again, feel free to ask questions or make comments in the chat room, and again, after we're done, hopefully we'll have some good discussion.
All right. Sorry about that. So can you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as I said, Molly Gaudioso. I am a senior community planner, planning consultant with Barton and Loguidice. I grew up in Webster, actually, and got my master's in city and regional planning at the Ohio State University. I hate saying that, but I'm obligated, I feel. And I have, a pretty diverse range of experience in both consulting and from the public sector perspective. I worked as a community city planning staff for a community out in Ohio. I also served on the City of Rochester's Planning Commission for a few years, and I've worked in a wide range of communities across New York State, from rural towns, small villages, to larger cities and larger towns, suburban areas. As well as some county work. So, I'm excited to do this with Jason. As he said, we're good friends, we're fellow planning nerds, and this is kind of a fun presentation for us to kind of just go through some of these things that have come up, over the last year, few years, and looking forward to the conversation. So some of the things that we're going to cover, we're going to talk a little bit about the Zoom towns concept and some of the other implications for migration of population, and then some of the other topics that relate to that in terms of accessory dwelling units. It's been a big hot topic coming up, home occupations and accessory commercial uses, which I think are a little less known, some of the limited contact services and outdoor dining things, as well as use of parks, biking, all as a result of increasing demand with COVID. And, everybody's favorite, the marijuana and cannabis regulation that's, coming right here to New York in the next year. And then finally, we want to wrap it up with some equity in planning and zoning. So I'll turn over to Jason to kick off the Zoom towns.
Great, thank you, Molly. And I should say too, just as an overview, this is an overview, right? So these are the topics that we've heard from the folks we work with, from the communities we work with, from our own observations as planners. There's nothing. This is not an exhaustive list or comprehensive, but it's our observations as professional planners, and we hope to raise awareness of these issues with folks out there in their own communities, and also hear from you about whether these are things you're hearing from your citizens, from your constituents, and raise awareness of these issues. So a lot of the things, obviously, are related to COVID, although many of these topics predate the pandemic. And as I'm sure most of you have heard, one of the catchphrases is that COVID has accelerated existing trends, and I think we're seeing that in planning as well. So none of these are necessarily new, but because of the pandemic and what we've gone through the past year and a half, we're seeing some of these trends accelerate. So what you're looking at here, the graph, which our friends at the Capital District Regional Planning Council has done, which I thought was a really interesting way to look at this population movement as a result of COVID, was looking at postal data and address change requests over the past year and a half. And so you can see in February and March of 2020 last year, the address changes from the 5 boroughs of New York City to the 4 counties of the capital region skyrocketed in that time period. Now, it's hard to say at this point how many of those are permanent changes. Are the folks are going to permanently relocate to, not only the capital region, but other upstate counties? I'd be curious to see this sort of data for the rest of upstate New York. But it's a very interesting data point that sort of confirms a lot of, the anecdotal accounts of people leaving the bigger, more crowded cities, and we're also seeing that in the real estate market. This is a article. It also appeared in the DNC. I happened to grab this headline from the Utica Observer Dispatch, but they're all Gannett papers, so they share articles. But this was last summer, and the upstate, especially upstate rural areas, are seeing a big increase in the real estate market. One of the other articles I read in the DNC said that I think in our region, Yates County actually saw the biggest percentage increase in home prices over the past year, which, if I had to guess, is related to the Keuka Lake and the Finger Lakes there. So the with the pandemic, many of you are probably working from home. I know Molly and I have been working from home as planners. We are starting to go back into the office, which personally I'm very glad to do. Working from home has not necessarily been good for me. There's too many distractions, and I miss the social aspects of work. So, but for many folks, working remotely has been a real benefit and an amenity, and will probably continue in some form once the pandemic is over. And one of the concepts that's been written about in sort of planning and development circles is the idea of a Zoom town. We're all on a Zoom meeting right now, and what the core of this is really for a lot of jobs, they can be done from anywhere, and that has freed people, many people, in being able to locate more or less wherever they want, with some caveats. So in terms of people looking to get out of, again, more crowded, more expensive, the coastal cities, and perhaps find a more affordable place to live, a higher quality of life in terms of access to scenic resources, recreational resources. You're seeing this across the country. So in the articles I read, places like Truckee, Nevada, Missoula, Montana, on the West Coast and into the Rocky Mountains, and then much closer to home, I think this is exactly what we're seeing in upstate New York, the Hudson Valley, the Finger Lakes, the Catskills. Some of the factors that make a particular place attractive to remote workers is good internet connectivity, which is a pretty basic requirement. So that, at least right now, there's many rural parts of our region and upstate New York that don't have good internet connections. So that would be a detriment if this is a avenue they're looking to pursue. And the other thing, because it will be times where people need to meet in person and go to the office, even if that office is in New York or Washington. One of the other characteristics of Zoom towns is to be within 90 minutes of a reasonably large airport. So I'm sorry, Warsaw and Penn, your airports probably don't count. But much of the region is within 90 minutes of Buffalo or Rochester or Syracuse, which would count. So those are a couple of the big factors. Oh,
sorry, Jason. If I could add to that too, this is a we could do a whole nother topic on this in terms of, like Jason said, COVID's kind of exacerbated these already rising trends. But the millennial generation, young professionals, empty nesters, seniors, there's a huge trend to downsize, to look to more walkable communities that offer a lot of these amenities and things that Jason's talking about. And as that relates to upstate New York, there's a big opportunity for a lot of our villages to offer that environment. And you're seeing a totally different demand for pattern of development than I think we're used to seeing in upstate New York. There's a lot more multifamily, townhomes, patio homes, mixed density development, multi-generational housing, things like that. I think hopefully, Jason, I did a good segue for you.
That was great. No, that was awesome. So yes, so Molly has highlighted the some of the real positive trends in terms of sort of changing how we look at communities and wanting to be more walkable and have goods and services available without having to get in a car. And so that's all great, and I do think, and in fact, those images on the previous slide are from our region. And if you're eagle-eyed, you might be able to identify one of our college towns, college village, and a small college city in the Genesee Finger Lakes region. But one of my fears is the unintended consequences of this trend, possibly. And that is rural sprawl. And if you go through these four images, these four steps here on the screen, this is a pattern we see time and time and time again across upstate New York, where a rural agricultural community or forested community, large parcels are divided into smaller parcels, initially along the public road frontage, because those are the easiest parcels to divide out, and the landowner will sell off one or two and make a quick $20,000 or $30,000 for a 3-acre parcel, big enough for a well and a septic system, for somebody to build their rural dream home. Some places are getting towards step 3, especially if there is public water available and can be a little bit more dense. And that's another factor in my fears on this, is we're seeing public water extended further and further into very low density rural areas. And I certainly understand the desire for that. Everybody deserves safe, clean drinking water. But again, there are potentially unintended consequences of continuing to build this public infrastructure into low density rural areas. Step 4 probably won't see a whole lot around here. That's more what you would see closer to Buffalo and Rochester in terms of suburban cul-de-sac type development, but it is a potential. And so, Molly, if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah. So, Molly mentioned, the opportunity in our villages in the region, and absolutely there are a lot of opportunities there. Unfortunately, our villages and small cities have some of the same problems as our larger cities: aging housing stock, aging infrastructure, concentrated poverty. Not everybody wants to buy a 130-year-old house in a village and deal with the issues of maintaining that kind of structure. And while compact infill development is certainly something that can happen, and we are seeing in some villages and cities, my fear is that we're going to see a lot more of the rural sprawl type of development, especially because these services that were formerly only available in villages and more densely settled areas, like public water, internet, good cell coverage, are now pretty much available anywhere, or initiatives are out there to make them available much more widespread than they have been. The other factor to consider is, where these folks are coming from. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate refugees in a minute, but you know, people that have the means to work remotely, to work wherever, coming from more expensive parts of the country, again, they may have a vision of rural life that is not that of living in a village or a city. You know, these are things to consider. You know, we don't obviously planners try to look ahead, but we don't have crystal balls. But I think the point is just to raise these issues and be aware of some of the potential downsides or unintended consequences of this. Next slide, please. So in addition, and again, you know, this goes back to how we mentioned that COVID has, you know, accentuated or accelerated existing trends, sort of related to the idea of being able to work wherever is not just people wanting to get out of downstate or big expensive cities, but to relocate to places in the north from places in the southern United States that may become not as pleasant places to live. Coastal Florida is already seeing big problems with, you know, flooding on a regular basis and sewer systems that no longer are draining because of rising sea levels. Personally, I find the existing climate of Atlanta to be not a great place to live. And if temperatures continue to rise, you know, I think there are going to be more and more people that feel it's not a great environment. And so there's been a fair bit of writing on, you know, where will these people go? And you know, there's been talk of, you know, Duluth, Minnesota, Burlington, Vermont, and places like Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse, where even in a warming climate, they still will be reasonable places to live and have access to abundant fresh water. Again, we don't know if this is going to happen, but this is what planners are talking about, and I think we need to be somewhat prepared for this because in my observation, this will create some of the same challenges as the Zoomtown migrants in terms of rural development. You know, people of means moving to upstate New York, who will want their, you know, 5-acre mini estate out in the beautiful bucolic countryside, but in the process of you know, dozens and dozens or hundreds of those, destroy the bucolic countryside that drew them in the first place. And that is the real conundrum with rural development in upstate New York, in my view. Go ahead, Molly. All right, so I'll turn it over to Molly to for the next few slides to talk about accessory uses and dwelling units and all that.
Yes. And, you know, just kind of to wrap that up, I think this is just one of the pieces, you know, additional housing sort of considerations, resources that are coming up right now. But, you know, there's a lot, like Jason said, to be considered in rural areas. How do you use tools like planned unit developments or cluster developments, things like that, to appropriately, you know, subdivide, allow for some of those other developments like he showed on the sort of step slide there. And then, you know, there's a lot of other pieces that, you know, we're seeing, and I've helped some communities over time develop in terms of either like mixed residential or infill residential or other land use regulatory tools that can sort of start to get ahead of the curve and regulate this before, like Jason said, it, you know, the demand is there and we're not quite ready to handle it. But one of the big pieces that has popped out of this as well is accessory dwelling units. So if you don't know what they are, you know, think about the Fonz living in the upper, you know, apartment above the garage. Accessory dwelling units can come in a lot of different forms. They can be, you know, a detached structure like that garage. It can be attached, an addition or other type of retrofit, can be in the upper level of a building, the basement in a building, all sorts of, you know, different configurations. And really the idea is it is its own independent unit. So it's different than, you know, one of the questions I get a lot is, you know, like a pool house. Well, the, you know, the wet bar and the the bathroom, don't count. So it's got to be, it's in an independent kitchen and bathroom facilities, so it could operate as its own unit. And the other question I get is, how is this different from a two-family home? And that is because the way that is the accessory dwelling unit is typically limited, and I believe in the building code as well, limited by the size. So typically it's around no more than 30% of the gross floor area of the structure itself, or if it's detached, somewhere typically actually around 500 square feet, but you have seen, depending on size of lots, up to 1,000. And those are the main components, but the other most important distinguishing piece is that it cannot be subdivided or separated from the actual primary dwelling unit on the lot. So whereas, you could have a two-family townhome that could have that property line right between the building, that is not something that can be done with an accessory dwelling unit. So, why would we consider these? Well, again, not to beat a dead horse, but this is really something that is just skyrocketed as a result of COVID. A lot of people are rethinking how they live, sharing spaces with having everyone in the home, multi-generational homes. Over time, right now, the supply, the actual growth of the ADUs has gone average at this point, about 9% between 2009 and 2019. And the demand for that has, clearly increased exponentially from 2000 at about 2% up to 7% now at this point, and that's only continuing to grow. This is a huge hot button issue on the West Coast with infill housing and housing affordability, but that also has applicability here. This is an easy way to diversify housing stock, to increase affordable housing options. Or smaller units, typically more affordable. Offers opportunities to age in place. You can have parents stay instead of having the senior living situation, they can stay at home, stay connected to the family, kids returning after graduation, things like that. And even caretakers and caregivers for older homeowners. It's also an opportunity to provide additional property income sources. In this case, there's a lot of challenges with housing cost burdens in this case, and it can help stabilize home ownership rates because you're giving people the opportunity to stay there and help subsidize their actual mortgage payments and things like that. It's a sustainable living option. We're not creating new infrastructure, not having to go put in more water, sewer, eat up that land like Jason was talking about in a lot of communities. And it has been shown in several studies to increase property values. It's very desirable. So how can you do this? Just as, there's a lot of codes. I think most often in my practice across New York State, I've seen that these are not permitted. And I think that's a reaction we've seen to not wanting renter properties, the sort of the stigma that comes along with that, right or wrong in a lot of cases. So, how can you accommodate this? How can you do it in a way that may fit within your own community? That's looking at where it might be appropriate in what districts, and neighborhoods, at what densities. There is the potential to tie this to a homeowner occupancy requirement. So, making sure someone's there that is tied to the property and can help maintain it, be there as a resource for the renter or whoever happens to be occupying that accessory dwelling unit space. A lot of concerns on off-street parking. So how do you accommodate? Can you accommodate that additional car in the driveway? Is there on-street parking available to support that? Size and setback limitations, same thing you would typically do with accessory structures. And a big one in this case is typically the concern of maintaining the character of the residential neighborhood. If it is within the structure itself, where are you locating entrances? Or if it's a detached structure, if it's a new build, does it reflect the character of the home? how the materials work with that. So these are just some examples of different ones that have been done pretty successfully. And I'll just add, the AARP actually has, believe it or not, a lot of really good resources on accessory dwelling units. They're big proponents of this, obviously, for many number of the reasons that I already listed. Another piece that ties into this, like Jason said, in terms of, bringing more into the home and how we use our home spaces, is the rise of home occupations and working from home, as well as something that I think maybe we're a little less familiar with, accessory commercial uses. Depending on how you define these and how your code defines these, they could really be the same. But typically we associate home occupations with limited impact businesses, professional offices, the accountant that works out of their house, those smaller scale, not likely to drive a lot of traffic, like a retail operation, or things like that. So, that is typically how we classify the home occupations, home offices, things like that. Higher impact businesses can also be permitted as home occupations or accessory commercial uses in this case, but there clearly are some concerns. This is an example of one where there's an auto repair station or structure that's been put behind this home, and you can see that essentially the entirety of the property has been paved over. Not only does that have some stormwater impacts, but it clearly alters the character of the neighborhood. Storing a lot of those larger vehicles and things in the front yard may not, if that's your neighbor, may not be the most enjoyable. And then you also have the concern of, if it's auto repair, can be some noisy tools and things like that. So, looking at your regulations, how do you balance that increased economic opportunity and that flexibility for the working from home space with the impacts to the neighborhood? This is another example of this is actually a hair salon with the residential unit above. So the accessory commercial uses, as I said, are typically considered similar to home occupations, but most of the time we think about them as those that present as commercial uses in addition to the residential component. So a lot of these that are considered to be more neighborhood friendly, again, these look at more service-oriented type businesses where you might have, a couple patrons at a single time, or it's a smaller scale retail shop or service shop, a cafe, a bike shop, a hair salon. The top right image there is actually of a hair salon. So you have the home, and then, this is in COVID times, the ability to, instead of having to pay for, if you're, just trying to start up your business, how are you supporting that as an incubator space instead of going and renting a chair in an established salon, which can be pretty expensive and cuts into your ability to establish your business? If you allow for accessory commercial uses in this capacity, it can really be a way to support your local entrepreneurship, give that increased economic opportunity, like I said, and provide that ease of access to local goods and services. If it's a home occupation, the person that lives there typically is the operator. So they're tied to the community. They're, a way to support local dollars. And like Jason said, and we talked about before, that walkability, that smaller scale environment. A lot of, in a recent survey that the census did of small businesses, 51% reported they have experienced a large negative effect, with almost 40% indicating a moderate negative effect. So, that's a huge thing to consider as we see already the exacerbated issues with retail, brick and mortar retail, with online shopping trends, things, delivery trends, things like that. As a component. So it's almost like we're going back to the very traditional times of that neighborhood bakery, the neighborhood, barbershop, things like that. And the last component, kind of wrap it up in the context of Jason's point about Zoom towns, with a lot of people moving more towards working from home, indefinitely, you're seeing these ripple effects of where your patrons are. And in this case, instead of going to the office and, having lunch at that restaurant out by the office park, or your building in downtown, you're going to be looking more for your local neighborhood opportunities. So, this is a a significant shift. And again, ways to regulate this very similar to accessory dwelling units, but looking at all of those components. In this case, a much bigger impact in terms of size, in terms of parking, and building design. So as I said, it's typically intended to be a little bit more commercial. You want that visibility to have the business be viable. This is an example in Strikersville, New York. It's a brewery that established, so you can see the home is right here. I've actually stumbled upon this and been to this brewery a few times pre-COVID. And when I went, it was just this front building here, and they did not yet have this parking area in the front. So you literally pulled up, you parked, and this is their front door, this is their patio, their kids are running around. You walk in to the brewery space. There's a tasting room there. They have small batch brewing happening in that structure. Clearly, they've been successful, so they've expanded into the patio and the additional business space back here, and now clearly adding this larger parking lot area. You can see this is a little more rural in context, larger lot area, but thinking about the balance here again. It's an incubator space. So as a business gets success, I would say the idea of your regulation, shape them for that opportunity, but as that stepping stool, but then encourage them to seek formal commercial spaces, as they continue to grow, as a benefit and an economic driver in your community. Going on to the rest of the commercial services, Jason.
Yeah, and thanks, Molly, for that. And what Molly was talking about, it really raises some really, I don't want to say deep philosophical questions about zoning, but because so many of us are working from home now and essentially have a home occupation because of the remote work, I think we need to reconsider how that's regulated, how much it's regulated, and how the zoning code treats that. So if 30% of your community is working from their home office, does that make it a home occupation? I mean, technically for the past year, I've been working from my home office in the city of Rochester, and I guess technically violating the zoning code because I do not have a permit for a home occupation. So zoning came about 100 years ago. It was all about the separation of uses, and offices over here and residences over here and retail over there. And that may not make sense anymore, or as much sense in the 21st century as it did 100 years ago. So,
and can I just add to that too, Jason? The zoning has done a lot of things that are, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's done a lot of things intentionally that have harmed communities, and it's done a lot of things unintentionally that have harmed communities in a lot of different ways, socially, economically, community character-wise. And, I think that's largely been a reaction of being afraid of these new things, these new trends, these new uses coming in, and not, knowing what to do with them per se. So, like Jason said, if we're thinking about that previous example, if it's a home occupation where for all intents and purposes, it's the house hasn't changed. There's a person in there working. Do you need to permit it? Do you need to require that special permit? Do you need to make them come before the board? Do you need to make them pay for that permit fee? All of those pieces, there's certainly things to consider in terms of impact as you get to increased intensity of use, but removing that red tape, I'm going to say that more than once today, but removing that red tape is significant and will be very important.
Yeah, absolutely. So changing gears a little bit, I struggled to come up with a catchy phrase to describe this. And the best I could come up with was limited contact services, because I didn't want to focus just on drive-throughs, and you'll see why in a minute. Obviously, the past year and a half, I think most of us have probably increased our use of drive-throughs as a way to, get takeout, do banking, get prescriptions without having to go into a building during the pandemic. And I think that's a really good thing in many ways. But again, there are unintended consequences. So, you know, drive-throughs do take up a lot of acreage to fit the queuing lanes, the maneuvering, you know, just being able to orient the drive-through so it's on the correct side of the building so the driver can get to the window. You know, not every site is going to be conducive to that, especially in places in your community where you are trying to encourage a walkable environment. So your more compact, denser parts of your community, whether you're a village with a main street, city avenues, or even hamlets or places like some suburban towns are trying to create a downtown where they never had one, and they don't have a village. I'm thinking particularly of Irondequoit with the Hudson Titus Cooper area, Greece with the Dewey Avenue corridor, and Brighton with 12 Corners. You know, so drive-throughs with their you know, big paved areas that wrap around the building, like you can see on the right. You know, these are not going to encourage necessarily the type of environment there that you're looking for. There are a few good examples locally that have done a little bit better job with this. The picture on the left is one of my favorites, the Tim Hortons in Bushnell's Basin on Route 96. Even though they have a drive-through lane between the building and the street, it's pretty subtle. It has some decorative paving, and it doesn't have the wide open asphalt expanse that you often see with drive-throughs. The other example was the Starbucks on Mount Hope Avenue in the city of Rochester. But you can go ahead, Molly. So, no problem. So the reason I didn't want to just call this drive-throughs is the idea of walk-up windows, which in the types of places I just mentioned, you know, our cities, our villages, our main streets, places where we want to encourage walkability or already have a lot of pedestrians, having a walk-up window in addition to or instead of a drive-through window can be a real amenity. The picture on the right shows that these are not limited just to restaurants. We have an innovative bookstore there. I believe that's in Kansas City, that did a walk-up window for their bookstore. The middle picture, of course, you can tell just exactly who that is, but even the big chains are doing walk-up windows in places. And I have to say, you know, in my own neighborhood in Rochester, there is a brand new Burger King under construction that I walk by every day. And I'm a little disappointed, actually, that there isn't going to be a walk-up window there because, you know, I, as a pedestrian, I'm not allowed to go through the drive-through. So my only option is to actually go into the building. And, you know, we hope the pandemic is over, but you don't know. And so having that walk-up window option in a pedestrian-oriented environment like my neighborhood in the city, or again on village main streets or parts of towns that are looking to encourage this, I think is really important. And you can't necessarily just leave it up to the chain to do on their own. If you're serious about this as a community, this is something you might want to mandate in your zoning code, that in certain areas, businesses that have drive-throughs also need to provide a walk-up window service. The picture on the left was one of my favorite examples during the pandemic. It's my neighborhood pub. And they had existing windows facing the street there, and they turned one of them into a sort of on-the-fly walk-up window. You could call in your order for dinner. I don't know what they were doing for drinks. I know the state did relax the liquor rules a little bit on carry out liquor, but we got dinner there for a few times, and it was great. You just walked up on the sidewalk there and got your order without even having to go into the building, which was a really creative example on their part.
Jason, you have a second for a want for the walk-up window at that Burger King in the chat.
Excellent. So, you know, related to this are the quote unquote curbside pickup that we've been doing a lot lately. The key thing to remember here is, depending on whether you literally mean curbside, like curb on the public street, which is the image on the right, or curbside in quotes, which is what a lot of places are calling it, but it's essentially you pull up in their parking lot and there may or may not be an actual curb there. There's just a designated space. The point is that these two approaches fall under completely different bureaucratic systems. So in a private parking lot, you would want to look at the parking regulations in your zoning code to accommodate these types of, short-term parking, and whether if you have parking requirements, would these just be included? Would they take away from the total number of parking spaces required? Could they overlap? Those are sorts of the things that you would want to clarify in your zoning code. In terms of sort of short-term on-street parking, that is handled more typically through your highway department, your Department of Public Works. In the city of Rochester, it's called the Department of Environmental Services, or whatever entity has jurisdiction. So in a lot of villages, Main Street is a state highway. I don't know for sure whether the state has authority over parking regulations on state highways that are also main streets, but that would definitely be something to look into with them. But certainly something to consider in commercial areas where you have a demand for this type of short-term, high turnover parking for folks that are just stopping to pick up their to-go orders.
So related to that, continuing, the use of space, or I guess sometimes considered untraditional use of space, with it respect to public and private property and commercial operations. Again, these are examples of outdoor dining. This was another thing that was a big boom as part of COVID. Clearly, businesses wanting to maintain their operations in a safer manner, and allowing for that outdoor seating. So, again, this is a thing that I see a lot of codes unduly restrict, in my personal opinion. And there were a lot of scrambles in the beginning of this to try to figure out new ways to do it, to get rid of that, the hoops that are, have to jump through to get that permit. So, on site within the property, this example on the left, I think is great. This is a Brick and Brew. It's a restaurant, brewery, bar that took over a Tim Hortons space in Syracuse. And instead of, ripping out the drive-through, they just threw up a fence and they put out some picnic tables and things out there and some planters and things to make it, a little, break up the space, feel not so auto-oriented. But, those are really great creative use as a result of COVID that gave them expanded their seating capacity once they were able to use indoor dining as well, but continue their operations outside as well. The same thing in terms of public right-of-way, utilizing sidewalks, on-street parking lanes, and even in some cases street closures. This example here I thought was really great. This is in Fells Point in Baltimore, Maryland. They literally built it around the street lamp and the street tree there, recognizing that those were, potential limitations. I thought it was really creative. And a lot of the spaces here in Fells Point, got really creative in how they designed things. You saw basic ones that were just sort of pallets, put into flooring and then benches and some tables and things like that. But others were, a little bit more creative in their branding and providing some of, a continued experience as part of their operation. Fells Point in this case pretty much gave all of these businesses, these are just line the streets, whether there was large enough sidewalk space as the previous image that I just showed, to utilize that versus the on-street parking spaces. And the piece that tied into this that I think was really interesting is they suspended all of the open container laws throughout that entire commercial district. And they saw such success and people, respecting it, over time, that they've decided to maintain it. They haven't put an end date on it. And it's created, I happened to go there as travel restrictions started to lift and just kind of visit. And the entire, area is much more friendly, connected. It's a more vibrant space to hang out and, to as a tourist, as a resident within that area. And as I said before, there's a lot of communities that struggled to allow this in a short amount of time, but saw places waiving the permit fees, allowing for temporary street closures. New York City did that in several places, just and set up even just sort of parks and hangout spaces, which we'll talk about in a second. Like Jason said before, if you're utilizing parking, whether it's on-site or on-street parking, the parking that you're minimum parking requirements you have for your uses, they basically said, doesn't matter, we're going to waive that even if you're taking away 5 spaces. We're just going to count that still as part of your parking requirement. City of Rochester actually established its own landing page and sort of guide to applying to various tiers, whether you're utilizing your own property, you're utilizing public property, sidewalks, streets, all of those different pieces. So they really laid that out, I think, in a way that made it a lot easier. And I'm certainly around my neighborhood, and Jason, I'm sure you have too, seen a lot more of that pop up for businesses, which has just made it, again, more of an exciting place to live and gives you a destination, something to walk to. So again, making sure you're reviewing your regulations for these things, increase the opportunity where you can, where it makes sense. Clearly there's still need for regulations in some of these situations. You don't want to block pedestrian traffic or vehicular traffic. You want to keep things safe. But getting rid of that unnecessary red tape is a big first step.
Yeah, I can't stress that enough, because these businesses are having a tough time as it is. Those of us that have worked in government, it's often really apparent to us that one department deals with streets and sidewalks and another department deals with private property, but to the average person, the average business owner, they don't care. They just want their permit. They want to get in and out as fast as possible. They want it to be as clear and as inexpensive as possible. And I think those of us in government could probably do a little bit better job with making it cutting the red tape, as Molly said, and making it as easy as possible. This next topic, again, this is nothing new. We've seen a lot of expansion of bike lanes, separated bike lanes, which you see on the right there. That's along Union Street in the city of Rochester. I believe it's was our region's first fully separated bike lane, physically separated. So you're not mixed in with the vehicular traffic. COVID has accelerated, I think, the people biking, whether it's those folks who don't have vehicles or can't afford vehicles and were afraid of taking public transit during the pandemic, or folks who do have a choice but found that bicycling was a great way to get exercise and get outdoors in a safe, socially distanced manner. So, I think things to be aware of in your community is, consider the entire system. I think, unfortunately, bicycle infrastructure, bike lanes, et cetera, is still the orphan in terms of transportation infrastructure, and it's put in a very piecemeal basis. And I think, imagine if the road network were put in fits and starts, and you couldn't connect easily between various segments of roadways. Well, if you're using a bicycle for actual transportation, missing links and gaps in the system is a real negative aspect of being able to use it as true transportation. The other thing to consider, in, of course, where we live, that if you want bicycling to be a true transportation option, you have to consider all season maintenance. You can't have a complete street if it's incomplete for 3 or 4 months of the year because you don't plow or do snow removal on your bicycle infrastructure and sidewalks. So another thing to keep in mind there. Molly, going to go back to Molly on this one.
Yeah, so building off of that, the trends, there's been over the last several years a push for that active transportation component, complete streets, walking, biking, facilitating that, and a huge piece of that is public health. 73% of the Americans that were hospitalized with COVID had at least one underlying condition. The most common being obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure. And those are all pieces that can, when you increase physical activity, even by a fraction, if it's 20 minutes a day, that can significantly reduce, the potential for those diseases to spread, to grow, and to be a countermeasure in that extent. So the idea, being increasing public health and well-being overall, community-wide level of activity, but also the use of open space and park space, particularly, again, being increased by COVID, people getting out of their homes, but wanting these outdoor spaces to gather, to recreate, to eat, just to hang out with friends and family. And so, one of the things that we've seen across the country, and you may have heard during, last year during the summer, that the trips to national parks were just skyrocketing to the point where their facilities were being overloaded, with the decreased staffing due to COVID, kind of having a hard time keeping up. In that case, Dallas reported that for, their popular trails, their visitation and use of those trails rose from 30% to 75% just in March of last year. And Monroe County has reported very similar trends as part of their infrastructure and the parks and things that we have around here. This is just an example. Our firm helped develop and plan, our landscape architects, and design a adventure zone in Highland Park. And in this area, this had much significant increased use as part, during COVID. It was a place you can see, I'm pretty sure that picture is pre-COVID, but it's the use of space in terms of the picnic tables. I know Jason's got a comment to that effect in a second, but, the use of picnic tables. And again, smaller spaces. One of the concerns that residents had was, large gatherings, the bridal parties or the showers or things that get used for the very large pavilions and things. So creating these smaller, more intimate spaces helps to just make, keep the activity a little more concentrated, but still provide these pocket opportunities for the neighborhoods. And then obviously you've got a ton of fun elements for the kids in this case, and just increasing all of that activity. And Jason, I'll let you tell
yes. So it's interesting. So my family lives near Buffalo. I'm in Rochester. Batavia has been a convenient meeting spot for us, especially during the pandemic. And what I realized just last week, we were planning to have dinner and thought about, are there any parks in Batavia where we could just bring a picnic and meet for dinner outside, and be able to bring our dog and all that. And as far as I could tell, in the city of Batavia, the parks, they have a few benches, but none of them that I could see, and I could be missing them, but had picnic tables. And I thought, well, there's an amenity in parks that might be more desirable these days, as people are looking to socialize outside and share a meal. Maybe they have family that are not vaccinated yet, or so on. So again, just something that I experienced personally recently that highlights how our sort of use of space and public space has changed over the past year and a half.
We got a comment. This sounds like somebody from Batavia. The county DeWitt recreation area has tables, but many of the city parks do not, unfortunately.
Yeah, Aaron, thank you for that. DeWitt is on my list of places to go. So yeah, but I was hoping, I think it's Centennial Park I was looking at, and didn't seem to have picnic tables or anywhere near downtown. So, but yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you.
You got to keep the waterproof blanket in the back of your car, like I do. idea for when, but for those things, it's also easily transportable if we're walking.
Well, I'll tell you, when your parents are 75, getting up and down from sitting on the ground is not an option.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. Real quick, wrapping up with our last few slides. Of course, one new thing this year is the new law in the state of a Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act. There is a ticking clock for any municipality that wants to completely opt out of having this in their community. And I believe it's by the end of 2021, you have to hold a permissive referendum to opt out. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details because I don't want to get them wrong, but I will. There are two links here. One, the newly established New York State Office of Cannabis Management, which hopefully will be able to answer a lot of questions, and an upcoming webinar presented by our friends at the Tug Hill Commission on June 1st with a couple of attorneys, one from the New York Conference of Mayors, the other from the Association of Towns. And I'm looking forward to that. You know, having the presenters from non-governmental organizations rather than state employees, they may be able to be a little bit more candid than government workers. So they should have a lot of information there. And Molly's put that in the chat window.
And if I could just add to that too, Jason, so the local land use regulation side of this is still pretty unclear, but it's my understanding that they are to be licensed similarly to an adult use instead of, like, you know, clearly here it's not through the liquor authority. So it's a little bit different, but you know, I believe, and we'll see as more direction comes out, that the standard approach in terms of your districting, in terms of what districts you might permit that in, where you might permit growing operations versus retail operations, and all of those things is something that you can consider, and that obviously also could include, you know, some other special use considerations as well.
The only other thing I'll say on this is, you know, a couple images there. You know, I think some folks may have an idea of what these places are going to look like. And these are from Massachusetts, which legalized a couple years ago. And, you know, they are not the necessarily the seedy hole in the wall, back alley type places that you may be imagining. So, so just keep that in mind as you have community discussions about this. And then finally, wrapping up on a really important topic that is getting a lot more attention these days, and deservedly so, are the historic origins of a lot of our planning documents and planning laws and zoning laws. You know, we don't have time to get into all of this. We could spend days just on this topic, but the idea is that zoning has some pretty negative elements in its origins, in, you know, not just separating uses, but separating people from each other. And other programs over the course of the 20th century, including federal urban renewal, federal highway construction programs, either consciously or inadvertently furthered this destruction of marginalized communities, separation of marginalized communities. And this is something that more and more communities are addressing. And it's not just an urban issue, that restrictive covenants that limited property sales to white people only, sometimes white Protestants only. We're not just in the city. Many suburban towns have those on their properties, and even the villages in our region had you know, had urban renewal occur, had immigrant communities that were often marginalized, and I'm planning a session at the fall local government workshop that's going to get into this in a lot more detail. So stay tuned on that. But that's our last content.
Can I just add a little bit to that, Jason? So, one of the things, as Jason said, the concept of redlining and urban renewal is there's a lot of resources out there. These are just a few in terms of the history and the roots of that and the impacts that it's had. And, this has really been cumulative over time in the sense that, redlining specifically created, very deliberate Black communities versus white communities. And there was a lot more compounding with that in terms of your ability to be able to get financing to own a home, which has then had economic impacts down the line and prevented communities of color from gaining wealth in home ownership and other components. And that exists, like Jason said, in rural communities, suburban communities, and urban communities. And it's as recently as a few years ago in Rochester, there was a redlining case. It was found, I believe it was Five Star Bank, was found to have violated redlining practices, as well as a few years ago, a community in Michigan was found to still have, unknowingly in this case, in the case of deeds, property restrictions, but, again, a whites only restriction in deeds. And that is, if you do a little digging, there's a lot of organizations around here, particularly in Monroe County. There's been a lot of research done in the towns that have had these. And obviously the effects, we can see them. They've been detrimental. And the ways that we address this have to be deliberate and quite frankly have to be interventions. We, simply removing it doesn't address some of those other issues. So that's a, whole different conversation, but a lot of resources out there to consider the ways that these various types of policies can be addressed. And again, it's, we have to be cognizant of it and be direct in terms of how we're addressing the policy moving forward. All right.
So with that, Molly and I have talked a lot. You're probably tired of hearing us. We've got a lot of great comments in the chat room, but at this point, let's open it up because we do have a fairly large group today, which is awesome. We got almost 40 people here. If you want to use the raise your hand function in Zoom, or if you want to turn your camera on and raise your hand physically, and Molly and I will be watching the chat room, and we'll call on folks if they want to comment or ask a question, because with 40 folks, we can't just open it up. Everybody will end up talking at once, unfortunately. So any thoughts from folks, questions, comments, criticisms?
It looks like James has his hand up.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, James.
Hi, how's everybody today?
Doing well, thanks.
Question on landlords and tenant issues. We're a small community, and we're getting to the point that it seems like the landlords, multiple tenant houses, are outnumbering the single family homes. A lot of them are absentee landlords, and you can only imagine the issues that we have going on with that. They were going to try to limit that a few years ago, but apparently that's a discriminatory process, so they couldn't. Are there any viable options on how to limit or at least control the number of what you would have, multiple tenant housings?
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly, limit how the square footage of apartments, or how much a single family home can be chopped up into smaller units. The city of Rochester does that. In fact, under its current zoning, it says no existing single family house in most zoning districts can be further subdivided. So it just out and out prohibits further chopping up of single family homes for the most part. That may be changing with the new zoning code, because there are of course negatives to that too. That doesn't address any houses that are already divided into apartments. One thing that comes to mind would be a rental registry and I'm trying to remember what it's called in Rochester, but basically that, you know, rental units are inspected on a regular basis. I think it's every 5 years, and you know, to make sure the minimal standards are being kept. I don't know, Molly, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, and that's certainly not something to overlook in terms of rental housing, whether it be built multifamilies or single family homes that are rented. You know, in that context, it's very hard because, as you said, zoning cannot regulate occupancy in terms of, you know, this can't be rental housing, or, you know, it has to be owner occupied, all of those pieces. Jason started to get to it. I think code enforcement is a big one. You know, it's resource intensive. I know it's hard for smaller communities, and you just sort of have that part-time CEO keeping on top of some of that stuff. It can be very hard to enforce. And then obviously if you have to get into more of a, you know, a legal process to get property owners to come through on that, you know, so it's rocking a hard place on that one. But I would say from your existing ones, you know, providing that enforcement is a big piece. There are communities that have created successful incentive programs for like first-time home buyer pieces that's, you know, start to try to get people to invest in homes. The community I used to work for in the city of Westerville, they actually had an incentive program that got people, if you purchased, you know, a single family home that had been broken up into 2 or 3 family, there was an incentive program if you were to purchase that, you know, as an owner and were to deconvert it back to, you know, a 2 or a single family. That was one thing that they tried to do as part of that. And, you know, with multifamily, the biggest problem, and it's sort of counterintuitive, as Jason said before, with zoning, we sort of said, all right, multifamily is going to go over here. Are built as 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 unit apartment buildings go over here. And the isolation of that doesn't help with that sense of community. So things like mixed residential districts that create, you know, a neighborhood that's a variety of single, 2 townhomes, patio homes, some multifamily homes. There's a lot of really good examples. If you look at Erie Station Village, and it's in Henrietta, right, Jason?
Yep.
Yeah, Erie Station Village in Henrietta, it's a very successful development you can look at a lot of homes. There's 5, 6 families that look like row houses, or that, you know, there's a 4 family that looks like a single family home, and it fits into the character and creates, again, that sense of community. There's also a larger number of units that are built as part of that. There's patio homes as part of that, and that, you know, again, can help to address and alleviate some of those problems, because, you know, I can attest to the fact on my street alone in the city of Rochester a few years ago, you know, these homes sold for a lot less, and they needed a lot of work. And once each of our neighbors started to kind of give some love into their front porches and other things, everybody else started to kind of do it and move down the line. So there's a community factor to that I think is not often discussed, you know, but from a regulatory perspective, it's a lot of enforcement and looking at how you structure your codes. Inspections is a big one, particularly.
Yeah, the other idea I had, and of course, you know, a lot of these are just are you know, small pieces that taken together may help the problem. But another thing the city did is for rental properties owned by out-of-town owners, basically anybody that lived more than a couple hours from Rochester, those owners had to designate a local representative to respond to issues that might crop up at a property. So you're not trying to chase down, you know, the owner who's in Miami Beach or Brazil or you know, the UK when there's a problem at a property. So that's something else to consider. And I know, Jim, you know, I know your situation. It's, you know, you know, a lot of villages in the region are struggling. Well, you're not a village anymore, I understand, but it's a, you know, an older community. You know, the housing is older. You know, the market forces are not there, and that's the case in a lot of you know, villages. You know, they're facing, as I mentioned in one of the slides, they're facing a lot of the same issues as our urban areas, at a smaller scale, but often without the same resources that a Buffalo or Rochester or Syracuse have to devote to these issues. So I totally sympathize. I mean, I think it's a larger conversation that we should probably have about how villages, or in your case, a former village, can address this. But you know, I'm sorry we can't offer more at this point.
Well, thank you, though. Appreciate it.
Other questions? I'm not sure, Jason, that the raise hand feature is turned on.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. It looks like it is.
I know folks have, it's Zoom, you know, Zoom is convenient, but I also can't wait to get back to in-person meetings because, you know, the buttons are always, not always in the same place. I feel like, and technology is tricky. So we did have a question about the recording. So yes, we haven't been able to record all of the sessions due to some technical issues, but all of the ones we have recorded are available on GFL's YouTube channel. And there's a link to that right from our local government workshop website. And then the PDFs of the presentations will be posted as well. Many of them are up, but it might take us another few days to a week to get all the rest of them up on our website. So, but yeah, if anyone has, you know, don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you can't find anything, you have trouble downloading, and I'll point you in the right direction as much as I can. All right. Well, I am not seeing any other questions at this point, or people wildly waving their hands around on camera, which is my default option for getting people's attention. So I just want to say, you know, Molly and I are both here as resources. You know, her firm does excellent work across upstate New York, and you've gone out of New York State at this point. Yeah. You know, I know her and John Steinmetz at Barton and Loguidice. I've worked with them for years. They do great work. And then we at the Regional Planning Council are a resource for our 188 municipalities in our 9 counties. So please don't hesitate to reach out to either one of us if you think that we can assist with any of your challenges in your communities, whether they're longstanding or whether they're one of these new hot topics. So thank you for attending today. With that, I will say have a good rest of the day, folks.